Hey guys, what's going on? It's Rekt Capital and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be focusing on when could Bitcoin peak in this bull market, because we've been talking a lot about where Bitcoin could peak, at which price point, but we're going to be looking at the curious roll of time in Bitcoin's price action. So let's dive into the update today. Let's dive into the video. This is, of course, a free newsletter that I posted and shared with readers of the Rekt Capital newsletter. So you can check out in the link in the description down below if you want to read through the details for yourself at your own leisure. But in this video, we're going to be focusing on 3 of the Bitcoin halvings. And speaking of these halvings, we're going to be focusing on any recurring tendencies in terms of the curious roll of time. So this is going to be halving number 1. And you can see here that if we just zoom in here on the chart, this is halving number 1. And 378 days before halving 1 is where we bottomed at $2.01. We rallied and then we pulled back, consolidation for a little while, then the pre-halving retrace at $15 being the peak, and then we reached the halving. So 378 days before halving 1 we saw a bottom, but 364 days after that we saw Bitcoin peak, right? We saw it peak. And the thing that we need to bear in mind about halving 1, post halving 1, is that we actually had 2 market cycles. And not many people talk about this for some reason, which is a bit of a shame, because it is a bit misleading to say that Bitcoin rallied 9,800% after halving 1. Because it did this in 2 market cycles. And this market cycle over here, the 2013 bear market retrace, where we saw an 80% retracement, this was, of course, caused by a fundamental catalyst at the time. So that propelled Bitcoin into a accelerated bear market, lots of panic and fear here. And arguably without that catalyst, we would have seen further upside. But you can't say that really in hindsight. But in any case, basically speaking, post halving number 1, we saw 2 market cycles take place, which doesn't happen for Bitcoin after the halving. We tend to see a bull market occur before the halving, a bull market bottom out, bull market begins once we see a bottom, price goes up, and then it peaks. That's usually a market cycle where we see a bull market followed by a bear market. So after halving 1, we saw 2 bear markets and we saw 2 bull markets. Very important to bear in mind, because Bitcoin didn't rally 9,800% after halving 1. It rallied some 2,000% or 3,000%, and then it rallied a similar amount later on, but after an 80% retrace. So this sort of 2-part market cycle isn't something that happens in Bitcoin's price history unless there's a black swan event causing this. But in any case, guys, the curious roll of time is that we saw a bottom prior to the halving, 378 days, and then a mirroring of the amount of days after the halving. Once the halving occurred, 364 days later, we saw a peak. The same amount of days that we saw a bottom before the halving, and then the halving to the top. Very curious there. Let's now move to Bitcoin halving number 2. So with Bitcoin halving number 2, around 550 days prior to the halving, 518 plus 28, where we actually saw a pre-halving retrace take place. So around 550 days before halving number 2, Bitcoin bottomed at $164 before entering an extended ranging period, from which price broke out and then rallied towards the upside for a pre-halving peak of 794 before retracing and then continuing towards the upside. Post-halving number 2, we saw an increase of 4,080%. But this increase occurred over the period of 518 days, very similar to the 550 days before halving number 2. Very curious roll of time. a mirroring in terms of the amount of days that we tend to see when Bitcoin bottoms prior to the halving, and then when Bitcoin peaks after the halving. Very, very interesting that we see this sort of thing happen here. And just like you can see here, once we bottomed, there was a bull market all the way to the peak and then a bear market. So one market cycle, contrary to what we saw with Bitcoin halving number 1. So if we continue to see this interesting roll of time play out for Bitcoin in the context of its halving event, specifically halving number 3, what could we potentially see? Well, Bitcoin bottomed at 3,152, around 511 days prior to halving 3. If we see 511 days, if we see a Bitcoin price peak 511 days after halving 3, then we'll see a peak in October 4th to be exact, but October. Will we see this mirroring, this curious roll of time where price bottoms 511 days before the halving and then peaks 511 days after the halving? Will we see this curious roll play out? It's very interesting that we arrive at quarter 4 here in October 2021. Really interesting, because if we cycle to the 4-year cycle theory, should Bitcoin rally for 511 days after halving 3, that would mean that Bitcoin would peak in early October 2021. And that's quite interesting because the 4-year cycle theory here suggests that we will see a peak this year. So let's dissect this a bit more, because as you guys know, I've been talking about this on the channel for a while now. If we look at the candle ones, this being 1 year, so candle 1 represents 1 year, the most euphoric, bullish, exponential, explosive growth in Bitcoin's price action. In candle 1, we see a wick, an upside wick occur. And then the candle actually closes at the end of the year below that wick. And we see the same thing in this candle. Candle 1 rises, peaks over here, and then closes the end of the year below this peak. So what that means for this candle is that we are probably also going to peak with an upside wick, reach whatever peak Bitcoin reaches, and then it will close the end of the year below that wick, below that peak. So that essentially means that we're gonna peak this year, but candle 1 is actually going to close lower than that peak. So for Bitcoin to be able to peak, it needs to peak near the end of the year, around the end of the year. And October 2021 is near the end of the year. It's the 10th month of the year. And there is some confluence there in terms of when Bitcoin might peak. Because remember, when we see a candle 1 peak, in the following year, the candle 2 tries to eclipse this peak, but it can't. It forms a lower high. In the same way that in this 4-year cycle, it peaks in candle 1 and then tries to eclipse this peak, but it can't. Lower high. And it's this lower high that continues to plague Bitcoin for most of the 4-year cycle that follows. So we'll probably see a wick to peak, a candle close below that wick, and then in 2022 we're probably going to see something like this where candle 2 will try to wick again, but we'll see a lower high form to kickstart the bear market, to essentially confirm the bear market. So very interesting confluence there, that the Bitcoin 4-year cycle is confluent with the curious roll of time that we might see a peak in quarter 4 of this year in Bitcoin's price action. Not necessarily where, but when. And Q4 of 2021 is potentially the time where Bitcoin will peak. And having said that, that's about it for today's video. Of course, if you enjoyed this nutshell of insights, feel free to subscribe to the Rekt Capital newsletter by clicking in the link in the description down below. Cutting edge, unbiased market analysis and research delivered straight into your inbox 3 times a week. And of course, like this video if you enjoyed it and want to see more videos like this in the future. And if you haven't yet, feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel so you know when the next video is going to come out, because the next video, well, you won't want to miss it. Thanks so much for watching today, guys. I'm Rekt Capital, and I'll speak to you in the next one. Speak to you soon.